I was 33 the night my family handed me a birthday cake in one hand and a release form in the other, and asked me to sign away my grandmother's inn before I'd even blown out the candles. But this story really starts 3 years before that, on an ordinary Tuesday in June, with 5 words my grandmother said to me at her kitchen table that I didn't understand until it was almost too late. My name is Nora Ashford. I'm 33 years old, and I've spent 11 years working as a title and trust paralegal, which means I have read more deeds, more wills, and more fine print than anyone else who was sitting at that table ever bothered to. My mother slid the folder across the birthday cake the way you'd slide someone the check at a restaurant you were eager to leave. "It's a gift, Nora," she said. "We're finally setting you free." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I read the first page, and I picked up the pen. But what none of them knew, what my mother, my father, and my sister had no way of knowing when they had that release notarized for $400, was that the thing they thought they were selling out from under me was never actually theirs to sign away in the first place. 20 minutes later, my sister posted a video of me signing it to the family group chat, captioned, "She took it well." 4 months after that, in front of 500 people at the party built to sell my grandmother's inn out from under her own memory, that caption would still be sitting in that group chat, unanswered, when the room went so quiet you could hear the ice cubes settling in the champagne. Nobody in my family ever saw any of it coming from the daughter they'd always called good with paperwork. Welcome back to the channel, where the quiet ones, the ones who read the fine print so nobody else has to, finally get to tell you the whole story, start to finish. If a calm kind of justice is your thing, settle in. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And go ahead and hit subscribe now, because you are going to want to be here for the ending. Let me back up. The Marrow Lake Inn has stood on the same 6 acres of Vermont shoreline since 1961, when my grandmother, Ruth Ashford, bought a falling-down hunting lodge with money she'd saved waiting tables and turned it, board by board, into 11 guest rooms, a dining room that smells permanently of cinnamon, and a dock where 3 generations of the same families have taught their kids to swim. My mother, Marlene, has run the front desk and the events calendar for 34 years, since she married my father, Wesley, who took over the inn's day-to-day management the year Ruth's knees finally gave out. My younger sister, Kendra, calls herself head of marketing, a title she gave herself the week she got engaged to a man named Todd Winslow, whose family's company builds shoreline condominiums up and down 3 counties. I never had a title at all. I just had a key. My grandmother put a brass skeleton key into my palm on that Tuesday in June, closed my fingers around it, and told me, "Sign whatever they put in front of you about money, Nora. Just don't you ever let go of that key." I laughed. I thought she was being dramatic, the way people get when they're 78 and starting to think in chapters instead of days. I did not understand, that afternoon, that she had just told me exactly how this would end. Growing up, there were 2 kinds of work at the Marrow Lake Inn, the work that showed up on the events calendar and the work that didn't. Kendra's work always showed up. She organized the 4th of July bonfire and made sure she was in every photo of it. She redesigned the inn's logo twice, 2 years apart, and billed both rounds as marketing consulting, even after she'd moved back home and started drawing a real salary from the business. My work was the other kind. I drove up from my apartment 2 hours away every other weekend to help my mother reconcile the books when the new software confused her. I found the water damage claim my father had let lapse and got it reinstated 3 days before the filing window closed, saving the inn $11,000 it did not have. I spent one whole October repapering the guest room leases after a county reassessment, sitting at the same kitchen table Ruth used to roll pie dough on, while my family assumed I was just visiting. At dinner, when there were guests at the table, I got introduced as, "Our other daughter, she's very organized," in the same even tone you'd use to describe a filing cabinet that had never once given anyone trouble. I didn't mind it as much as I probably should have. I liked being useful in a way nobody had to thank me for out loud. I told myself that was maturity. It took me a long time to understand. It was just a very patient kind of hunger, and that patient hunger, left alone long enough, starts to look a lot like consent. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to. From the September I turned 28. The inn was hosting its anniversary weekend, the 60th, a big one, with a banner and a hired photographer, and half the county on the lawn. I'd spent 4 days beforehand color-coding the reservation spreadsheet so the front desk wouldn't double-book the 2 biggest suites, a mistake that had happened at the 55th and cost my parents an ugly refund and an uglier review. Nobody asked me to do it. I just did it, the way you learn to do things in a family that never explicitly asks, but always somehow expects. The morning of the party, my father stood on the porch steps and thanked, by name, the florist, the caterer, Kendra, for making it all look so beautiful online, and the guests for 60 years of loyalty. He did not mention the spreadsheet. He did not mention me. I stood near the lemonade table in a dress I'd bought for the occasion and clapped along with everyone else, and told myself it didn't matter, because I already knew where the good rooms were and nobody had to double book anything that year. That was the trade I'd been making my whole life without ever calling it a trade. I'll do the invisible work if I get to keep the quiet competence that comes with knowing exactly how everything actually runs. The Tuesday in June I mentioned came the summer I turned 30, less than 2 years before my grandmother died. She asked me to drive up on a weekday, which she never did. Ruth Ashford did not waste a weekday on anything that wasn't the inn, and when I got there, she was sitting at her kitchen table with a folder of her own. A plain manila one, unmarked, that she never once let me see the inside of. She talked instead about the carriage house, the crumbling 3-room outbuilding behind the inn that nobody had touched since before I was born, its windows boarded, its roofline sagging, like it was tired of waiting for someone to notice it. She said she wanted someone to fix it properly, slowly, with their own 2 hands, not hire it out to a crew that would gut it in a week and get it wrong. She didn't ask me to be that someone, she just mentioned it, the way you'd mention a thing you already suspected somebody was going to do anyway, and let the silence after it do the asking for her. I started that August, alone, mostly because I liked having somewhere at the inn that was fully, uncomplicatedly mine, to make mistakes in. I bought my own tools. I took a weekend course on window restoration 2 towns over. I kept every receipt, every permit, every photograph of the work in progress, out of the same habit that makes me photograph the odometer on a rental car before I drive it off the lot. I didn't know yet that a habit and an inheritance can end up being the exact same thing, filed under 2 different names. My grandmother died the following spring, quietly, in the room she'd always called Room 1, with the good view of the dock. At the funeral, held in the inn's dining room, because she'd never once slept anywhere else in 60 years, my mother thanked everyone for coming to celebrate the woman who built all this, and gestured at the building behind her, the way you'd gesture at a house you were already, quietly, picturing with a different name on the sign. I noticed it. I didn't say anything. Some things you let people finish saying before you decide what they actually meant by them. What I remember most from that week isn't the funeral. It's that my mother, going through Ruth's closet to decide what to donate, found the brass keys twin, a spare, on a ring with a tag that said, in Ruth's handwriting, Nora's, and asked me mildly if I still had mine. I said I did. She nodded, and put the spare in a drawer, and never mentioned it again. I don't think she thought anything of it at all. I think about that drawer more than almost anything else in this whole story. For about a year after the funeral, things at the inn were quiet in the way things get quiet after a death. Everyone a little careful with each other, a little slower to complain. That changed the spring Kendra got engaged. Todd Winslow came to a family dinner for the first time in April, in a blazer that looked expensive in the specific way that made my father sit up a little straighter, and spent most of the meal asking my parents thoughtful, friendly questions about the business side of running the inn, occupancy rates, the age of the roof, whether the land had ever been appraised. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was just a young man trying to impress his future in-laws by taking an interest. I want to be honest with you about how long it took me to see it differently, because I think a lot of people watching this have been exactly that slow to notice exactly that kind of interest, and I don't think being slow to notice it makes you foolish. It just makes you someone who was raised to assume family conversations don't have agendas. I remember one exchange from that first dinner specifically, because I wrote it off at the time, and I think about it now almost weekly. Todd had asked, in the middle of the salad course, whether the inn had ever had the shoreline surveyed for what he called development potential, and my father had laughed it off. "We're not selling anything, Todd. Don't get ahead of yourself," in a tone that was clearly meant to be a joke between future family. Todd smiled and said, of course. I'm just naturally curious. It's the business I'm in," and reached for his wine, and the conversation moved on to Kendra's dress fittings before anyone could sit with it too long. I laughed along with everyone else. Kendra brought it up again herself, months later, over coffee, phrased as a compliment. "Todd thinks the property's worth way more than Dad realizes," she said, stirring her drink instead of looking at me. "He says a lot of these old family places are basically sitting on money nobody's ever bothered to count." I asked her what that meant in practice. She shrugged and said she didn't really pay attention to the numbers side, that was Todd's thing, and asked if I'd RSVP'd yet for the engagement party. I said I would. I did not ask a second question, which is, in hindsight, the exact moment I could have changed how the next 2 years went, and didn't. By that autumn, there were surveyors on the property twice, once for what my father called insurance purposes, once for something Kendra described, when I asked, as, just Todd being thorough, he's very detail-oriented. I wasn't invited to either visit, though I found out about both of them after the fact, from my mother, in passing, the way you find out about weather that already happened. I started noticing other things too. A folder on my father's desk, labeled, in his handwriting, options, that he closed a little too quickly when I walked into the office. A Sunday planning call I used to always be looped in on, that quietly stopped including me sometime around January, with nobody ever mentioning the change out loud. I asked Kendra about it once, lightly, over coffee. She said, "Oh, it's mostly just booking stuff now, you'd be bored," and changed the subject to her wedding colors. I let her change it. That was the small test I failed before I ever knew there was going to be a bigger one. I had every chance, that whole year, to ask a direct question and demand a direct answer, and every time, I chose the version of the conversation that let everyone stay comfortable, including me. The dinner was on a Friday in April, in the inn's private dining room, the one with the good chandelier that only comes out for anniversaries and wakes. There were a dozen or so of us, my parents, Kendra, Todd, my aunt and uncle from Burlington, and a handful of my parents' oldest guests who'd become something like family over 60 years of returning every August. My mother had ordered a cake with my name spelled correctly for once. I remember thinking that was a good sign. I was wrong about that, in the specific way you can only be wrong when you've spent your whole life training yourself not to expect much, and calling the training gratitude. My father stood up around dessert and gave a toast that started warm and ended strange. Something about how not everyone is built to run a business, and that's all right, that's not a failure, that's just knowing yourself. And I watched my mother's hand find a folder tucked under the edge of her chair before he'd even finished the sentence, the way you'd watch someone reach for a seatbelt right before a turn they already knew was coming. She slid it across the table between the cake and the candles. "It's a gift, Nora," she said, "and I want you to understand." She said it gently, the way you'd tell a child something sad about a pet that had gotten old. "A full release. $40,000 for your membership interest in the business, effective immediately." We talked to a lawyer, Todd's family's lawyer actually. He was wonderful about walking us through it. And this way, you're finally free of all the obligation. You can go build whatever life you actually want, instead of always being pulled back here on your weekends. I looked at Kendra. She had her phone up, angled, the way she angled it for every inn social media post, except this camera wasn't pointed at the cake. I looked at my father, who wouldn't look back at me at all, just at his plate, at the good chandelier, at anywhere that wasn't my face. I looked at the folder. I opened it. Family Settlement and Membership Release Agreement, in Re. Marrow Lake Hospitality, LLC. $40,000 in exchange for a full and permanent release of any and all interest, claim, or expectation in the business. The business, the document specified, 3 separate times, never once the property it sat on. Somewhere underneath the part of me doing quiet math on what $40,000 was worth against 15 years of unpaid Saturdays, another part of me heard my grandmother's voice from that kitchen table, clear as if she were standing behind my chair. Sign whatever they put in front of you about money. I picked up the pen. My hand did not shake. Thank you, I said. This actually makes things a lot easier. My mother looked relieved in a way that told me more than the document itself had. My aunt clapped, once, uncertainly, unsure if this was the kind of thing you were supposed to clap for. Kendra leaned toward me across the table, phone still angled, and said, in the bright, encouraging voice she uses for the Inn's Instagram captions, "This is honestly so mature of you, Nora. A lot of people would make this so much harder than it needs to be." Todd nodded along, murmured something about how he'd seen a lot of families struggle with exactly this kind of transition in his line of work, as though I were a zoning variance he was walking through committee. My father still hadn't looked up from his plate. Only my uncle, from Burlington, caught my eye across the table for a moment, and I watched him almost say something, and then watched him decide, the way people in that family always decided, that it wasn't his place. I didn't blame him for it. I understood that decision better than anyone else at that table. For one long second, pen in hand, I considered asking for a week to have someone look it over. I could see exactly how that sentence would land. The confusion, the hurt performance of it, my mother's face rearranging itself into something wounded and reasonable at the same time. Kendra's phone still recording all of it for an audience of people who'd call me difficult by Monday. I did the math the way I do math for a living, quickly and without much sentiment. A week of that particular weather, against a signature that I already suspected, standing at the edge of something I couldn't yet name, might not cost me nearly as much as everyone in that room believed it would. I signed on the line. I did not read past the first page, because I already understood, with a calm that surprised even me, sitting there under a chandelier that only comes out for anniversaries and wakes, that the page in front of me and the thing they actually believed they were taking from me were not, in the end, ever going to turn out to be the same document at all. I said okay that night. I want to be precise about this, because it matters for everything that comes after. I meant a very different kind of okay than the one my family heard. Kendra's caption on the video was, "She took it well," and it picked up 11 likes from people I'd known my whole life before I'd even reached my car in the parking lot. I drove the 2 hours home with the radio off. I did not cry. I let myself into my apartment, fed my cat, and sat on the floor of a room I rent by the month, thinking about 11 guest rooms, and a dock, and a woman who used to let me stand on a kitchen chair to reach the mixing bowl for her cinnamon rolls every Sunday of my childhood. What none of them had thought to ask, in the rush to get my signature before I changed my mind, their words, said to each other in the kitchen while I was getting my coat, not to me, but the door doesn't block much sound in that house, was where I had actually spent every one of the Saturdays they assumed I'd finally given up. I still owned the carriage house key. Nobody had ever asked for it back, because as far as any of them knew, it opened a shed nobody had cared about in 30 years. 3 weeks after the dinner, an email arrived from Frank Delaney, the attorney who had handled my grandmother's affairs for 40 years, a man I'd known since I was young enough to sit under his desk during closings while Ruth signed papers above me. The subject line said, simply, "Ruth's Trust, time to talk." I want to tell you that I already suspected, at that point, what I was about to find out. I didn't. I called him back thinking it was routine paperwork, some final loose end from probate, 3 years closed. It was paperwork. It was just not the kind I expected, and it was about to turn everything I thought I understood about that birthday dinner completely upside down. Stay with me. The part of this that changes absolutely everything is only a few minutes away now, and, if you've ever been the responsible one in your own family, the one everyone assumes will be fine no matter what gets handed to them, I promise you are going to want to be subscribed before we get there. Frank's office still smells like the same pipe tobacco it did when I was 7 years old, waiting under his desk with a coloring book while my grandmother's pen scratched away somewhere above me. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Your grandmother restructured her estate about 3 years before she passed, he said, and slid a folder across a different desk, plain, unmarked, and I realized, with a strange lurch in my chest, that it was the exact twin of the one she'd never let me see at her kitchen table. She pulled the real property, the land, the inn building, the carriage house, out of the operating company entirely and placed it into a separate trust. The business that sells the rooms and the dinners, the LLC your parents run day to day. That's one legal thing. The dirt and the buildings underneath it have been a different legal thing for 3 years now. Your family has been operating a business on land they don't actually own, Nora, and none of them have any idea. I asked him why nobody had ever mentioned it. Because she asked me not to, he said, unless somebody ever tried to sell or transfer the property without the consent of the trust's beneficiary. She was very specific about the trigger. She used the word unless 3 times in one meeting, which, if you knew your grandmother the way I knew your grandmother, you'll understand, meant she was already fairly sure it was going to happen. He turned to the second page and read it to me slowly, like he wanted to watch my face while he did it. The trust named its successor trustee and sole beneficiary as whichever of Ruth Ashford's grandchildren could demonstrate continued, documented stewardship of the property, defined, in language I recognized instantly as unmistakably my grandmother's, as physical possession of the original 1961 door key, and no less than 3 years of personal, evidenced investment of labor or funds toward the property's upkeep. I sat very still in that leather chair for what felt like a long time. I thought about a shoebox of receipts. I thought about a contractor's invoice for a new sill on the parlor window. I thought about a Tuesday in June, a key closed into my palm, and 5 words that had sounded, at the time, like sentiment from a woman who'd started thinking in chapters. They had never once been sentiment. They had been instructions, filed 3 years early, in the one language my grandmother knew I would never fail to take seriously. She had built a legal trap 3 years wide and set it walking slowly toward a moment she would never live to see. And I was sitting in the exact middle of it, wearing the only key that had ever actually worked. "Does anyone else know?" I asked. Frank shook his head. "Just us, and now you," I asked him, carefully. What would happen if the LLC, the business, not the land underneath it, were sold to an outside buyer without anyone realizing the ground didn't come with it? He said the sale would legally go through exactly as written. The buyer would simply discover, on the far side of closing, standing on someone else's dirt, that they had purchased a hospitality business with nowhere left to put it. It was around then, sitting in that same chair, that I asked him a second question I already half knew the answer to, and he confirmed what an old family friend had already hinted at weeks earlier over coffee. In the careful, sideways way, people tell you things they think you already know. Todd's family company, Winslow Shoreline Group, was deep in talks to buy the Marrow Lake Hospitality LLC outright and convert the inn into 8 luxury lakefront condominiums. The carriage house, my carriage house, 3 years and $11,000 of my own money into being brought back from the dead, was marked on Todd's earliest site plan, Frank had heard, as future parking for unit owners. That same week, I did something that had nothing to do with Frank or the trust, and everything to do with 11 years of professional habit. I looked up Winslow Shoreline Group's other projects. It didn't take long to find a pattern, because companies like that rarely bother hiding one from anyone who knows where to look. 2 years earlier, they'd converted a 100-year-old family-run motor lodge on Lake Champlain into 14 units, after buying out 4 of 5 siblings who co-owned it and leaving the 5th, an 81-year-old man named Arthur Pelletier, to sell his remaining fifth share for what a local paper up there had called a fraction of its worth, once he was the only holdout left standing. The year before that, a marina. Before that, a family orchard turned into agrihood, townhomes with a single preserved apple tree in the courtyard, as what the brochure called a heritage feature. I sat at my kitchen table with all of it open on my laptop and understood, in a way that made the whole thing feel less personal and somehow worse at the same time, that my family hadn't been targeted because anyone at Winslow Shoreline Group thought Ruth Ashford's life's work was special. We'd been targeted because we fit a shape they already knew exactly how to close a deal around: an aging founder, a next generation eager to cash out, and one inconvenient holdout who could usually be made to sign something at the right family gathering, under the right amount of gentle, well-timed pressure. I printed 6 pages of it and added them to the folder, not because Frank said I'd need them, the trust stood on its own, he was clear about that from the start, but because I wanted, somewhere in the file, a record of why I'd stopped feeling any guilt at all about what I was building. This was never only going to be about a carriage house. Arthur Pelletier's motor lodge is 14 identical gray units now, with a landscaped border where his family's sign used to stand. I didn't know him. I never met him. I thought about him anyway, more than once, in the weeks that followed, and about how much easier that whole outcome might have gone for him if just one person in his family had happened to be holding the right key at the right time. I did not call my family that week. I did not call them the week after that either. Instead, I did what I have done professionally for 11 years, which is build a file the quiet, patient way, one document at a time, the same way you'd restore a window, pane by pane, never rushing the putty. I pulled every receipt from 3 years of carriage house work out of the shoebox and had them scanned and dated properly. I tracked down the contractor who'd pulled my permits, a man named Silas who remembered me fondly because I'd once brought him a plate of Ruth's cinnamon rolls on a January morning when the heat in his truck had died, and I asked him to write a short letter confirming the scope and timeline of the work. Frank said a judge, or a room full of skeptical relatives, which in some ways is worse, would want more than my word for it, even though nobody was using the word judge out loud yet. I asked Frank to have a second attorney independently confirm the trust's validity because I wanted a document this quiet to be completely bulletproof before I ever let another living soul see it. I drove out to the carriage house that same night, let myself in with the key I'd started wearing under my shirt, and sat for a while on the floor of the parlor in the dark, the way I used to sit on the floor of my apartment the night of the dinner. I thought about the spare key my mother had found in Ruth's closet after the funeral, the one tagged Nora's in my grandmother's handwriting, and I thought about the fact that my mother had put it in a drawer without a single question, because as far as she knew, it was just sentiment, the same way the whole trust had looked like sentiment to me at that kitchen table 3 years earlier. I understood, sitting there in the dark, that my grandmother had spent the last years of her life leaving a very specific kind of evidence in a lot of ordinary-looking drawers, and that the only difference between my mother and me was that I had finally been handed the one piece of paper that told me what the rest of it meant. I want to pause here and say something directly to anyone watching this who has ever been the one who signs first and asks questions. Never. I had every opportunity, at that birthday dinner, to ask to take the folder home and read it overnight with a lawyer of my own in the room. I didn't. I picked up the pen because some old, tired part of me had decided a long time ago that being agreeable was the fastest, cheapest way to be loved in that family, and old habits do not check their own math before they act. If you're sitting there right now thinking you would never have signed anything without your own counsel present, I believe you completely. And I'd only ask you to sit for a moment with why it took me 33 years and a dead grandmother's foresight to learn a lesson you already seem to know. I ran a small, quiet test of my own that spring, mostly without deciding to. I let the family go on believing exactly what Kendra's caption had said, that I'd taken it well, moved on, found other things to do with my Saturdays. I stopped being copied on the events calendar. I stopped being invited to the Sunday planning calls, The ones that had quietly excluded me, even before the dinner, but now didn't even bother pretending otherwise. Not one person in that family reached out, in 4 full months, to ask how I was doing, now that I was supposedly free to build whatever life I actually wanted. They had never really wanted me around at all, as it turned out. They had wanted my signature. Once they had it, they discovered they didn't need the rest of me, and the silence that followed told me more clearly than any legal document ever could exactly how much of my whole life there had been love in that house, and how much of it had simply been very good, very patient bookkeeping on their side too. I ran one small, deliberate test of my own that June, the kind Ruth would have recognized immediately, even if nobody else in the family would have. Every quarter for 9 years, without ever being asked, I had emailed my mother a short reconciliation summary, occupancy against projections, a flag on any invoice that looked off, the kind of thing that took me 40 minutes and saved her hours. The June after the dinner, I simply didn't send it. I didn't announce that I wasn't sending it. I just let the date pass, the way you'd let a light stay off in a room you'd already decided to stop walking into. 6 weeks went by. Nobody called. Nobody texted to ask if everything was all right, or noticed out loud that the numbers looked a little rougher than usual, or wondered, even once, where the summary had gone. I want to be fair here. I don't think anyone in my family consciously decided I was no longer useful to them. I think it never once crossed their minds to wonder, which is a much lonelier thing to learn about people than if they had decided it on purpose. My grandmother used to say that patience isn't waiting, it's knowing the right moment when it finally comes. I didn't feel patient that June. I mostly just felt like someone standing very still in a house that had already, quietly, stopped counting her as a person who lived there. A few weeks later, I did something I'm less proud of, though I've made my peace with it. My father called, once, about something unrelated. A question about an old insurance form he could have answered himself in 10 minutes with the file I'd organized for him 3 years earlier. And I let the call go to voicemail, and I did not call him back that day, or the next. When I finally did, 4 days later, I told him I'd been busy with work. It wasn't entirely a lie. I was busy. I was busy building a file with my name on every page of it, in a lawyer's office 2 towns over, and some part of me needed to know, before I ever showed anyone that file, exactly how long my family could go without me before they noticed the shape of what was missing. The answer, it turned out, was a very long time. I drove past the inn one Sunday not long after, on my way back from visiting my aunt in Burlington, without planning to stop. I told myself I was just taking the scenic route. There were 2 orange survey stakes at the edge of the carriage house lot that hadn't been there 2 weeks earlier, ribboned in plastic tape, and a small laminated sign zip-tied to the split-rail fence along the road that I had to pull over and read twice to be sure I wasn't imagining it. Lakeside Residences at Marrow Lake, coming soon, it said, over a rendering of a building that was, unmistakably, a taller, glassier version of the carriage house I had spent 3 years and $11,000 bringing back to life. Its window trim redrawn in a modern black I would never have chosen, and its front door, my front door, the one the brass key still opened, gone entirely, replaced in the drawing by a bank of mailboxes. I sat in my car on the shoulder of that road for a long time. I did not go inside. I did not call my parents. I took 4 photographs of the sign with my phone, dated automatically, time-stamped, the same instinct that makes me photograph a rental car's odometer, and I drove the rest of the way home with both hands on the wheel and the radio off for the second time in this story. I want to tell you I felt rage in that moment because rage would make a better scene. What I actually felt was closer to relief, which surprised me more than the sign did. Some part of me had been waiting, since the night of the dinner, for a piece of solid ground to stand on, something I could point to later and say, this is real. I didn't imagine the shape of what they were planning. And there it was, zip-tied to a fence in the late afternoon light, more honest than anything anyone in my family had said to my face in over a year. I photographed the sign. I did not tear it down. My grandmother didn't raise me to make scenes on the side of a county road. She raised me to build a file. I saw my mother exactly once during those 4 months, by accident, at a gas station halfway between our two towns, both of us pulling in from opposite directions, like something out of a story she'd never believe she was in. She looked tired in a way I hadn't let myself notice under the good chandelier the night of the dinner. We talked for 11 minutes about nothing: gas prices, an aunt's hip surgery, whether the lake was low again this year. Just before she got back in her car, not quite looking at me, she said, almost to herself, "Your grandmother never once put my name on anything here. 34 years, Nora." I didn't understand yet how much weight that one sentence was going to end up carrying. I filed it away the way I file everything, out of habit, and drove home, and kept building my folder pane by pane. Frank and I finished confirming the trust's validity with the second attorney by early June, about 2 months after the dinner. By then, the invitations had already gone out for what my family was calling the Marrow Lake Inn's one last Founders Weekend, a nostalgic, sold-as-bittersweet celebration of 61 years, with the Marrow Lake Gazette confirmed to send a reporter, and, I would only learn later from that same old family friend, a private reception afterward where Winslow Shoreline Group planned to formally unveil the condominium renderings to a small group of their investors. My grandmother's face, cropped from an old photograph behind the front desk, was going to be printed on the commemorative program. If any part of this is landing close to home for you, if you have ever watched people use somebody's memory as the marketing copy for the very thing that person spent their whole life protecting, go ahead and drop a comment about it below. And hit subscribe if you haven't yet, because the part where all of this finally lands in one room together is only a few chapters away now. I was invited to the Founders Weekend the way you invite a name on a list, not a person you actually expect to show up and matter. Kendra's text read, "Obviously you should come, you're still family, lol," with a laughing emoji that told me exactly how much thought had gone into sending it. I said I'd be there. I did not tell her why. I spent the 2 weeks before the event finishing the carriage house's last unfinished room in the evenings after work, the one Ruth had always called the parlor, mostly because I wanted at least one part of that property to be fully, provably, unmistakably mine by the time anyone else in my family understood what mine was even going to mean. Sanding the old floorboards by lamplight, I found my grandmother's recipe box in a drawer I hadn't gone through yet, tucked behind a stack of old guest ledgers going back to the 60s. Cinnamon rolls, read the card on top, in handwriting I would know anywhere on earth. I made a batch on the Sunday before the event, alone, in a kitchen that wasn't technically mine yet, by any document except the one that actually mattered. The morning of the Founders Weekend, I put the folder, my folder, the real one, the one Frank and I had spent 3 months building, into a canvas bag, along with 3 years of dated receipts, Silas's contractor letter, the original recorded trust instrument, a certified copy of the 1961 deed, and my grandmother's brass key, which I had worn on a cord around my neck, tucked under my shirt, every single day since the afternoon in Frank's office. I asked Frank if he'd come as my guest for the evening. He said, in the driest tone I have ever heard a 70-something-year-old man use, that he genuinely would not miss it for anything. The inn looked beautiful that evening. I'll give my mother that. She has always known how to make flowers do exactly what she wants. Close to 500 people moved through the gardens and the dining room and out onto the dock over the course of the afternoon. Long-time guests who'd been coming every August since before I was born. Townspeople, a photographer from the Gazette with 2 cameras around her neck, and a cluster of men in good, quiet suits I didn't recognize, standing near an easel covered by a sheet close to the carriage house, my carriage house, with architectural renderings underneath it, waiting for their moment. My father found the microphone a little before 6. He thanked everyone for 61 years. He used the word chapter twice in under a minute, and I remembered, standing near the lemonade table in the same spot I'd stood at the 60th anniversary 5 years earlier, that he had used almost that exact word in the toast the night of my birthday dinner, too. Todd's father shook hands warmly with people whose sheets I used to help my mother fold as a teenager. And then my father said, in the easy, practiced voice he saves for toasts, that he'd like to invite anyone who wanted to say a few words about Ruth to come on up and share them. And I set my glass down on the nearest table, and I walked to the front, and the whole garden turned to look at the other daughter, probably expecting exactly the kind of thing they'd always expected from me. Something quiet, something brief, something that wouldn't take up too much of anyone's evening. I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate my grandmother, and I meant every word of it. I said Ruth Ashford built this place with waitressing money and stubbornness and a kind of foresight most of us don't earn until it's too late to use it, and that she would want every single person standing on this lawn to know exactly what they were celebrating before the evening went any further. Then I said, in the same level voice I used to read a closing statement out loud, that the rendering waiting under that sheet by the carriage house showed a building that was not, in fact, part of any sale currently being discussed tonight, because the land, the inn, and the carriage house had not belonged to the Marrow Lake Hospitality LLC for 3 years. I saw Colette, from room 4, put her wineglass down slowly on the nearest table. I saw the mayor, who'd come as a family friend and not in any official capacity, take half a step closer without seeming to notice he'd moved. 500 people is a lot of witnesses to have accidentally invited to your own undoing, and I understood, watching the garden go still around me, that my family hadn't just staged a party. They'd stacked a room full of the one thing that could never later be talked back out of what it had seen. A reporter already writing the first line of her story in her head, and 499 other people who would all describe, for years afterward, the exact same 4 minutes, the exact same way. I asked Frank Delaney, standing near the back of the crowd in the same gray suit he wears to every closing he has ever attended, if he would mind confirming that for the room. He didn't raise his voice either. He simply said, clearly enough to carry to the dock, that he had personally drafted and recorded the Ruth E. Ashford Property Trust 3 years earlier, that its named trustee and sole beneficiary was standing at the front of this garden, and that the trust's public record was available to anyone at the town clerk's office who wanted to verify it before they signed a single additional thing tonight. I laid the documents on the podium one at a time, the way you'd lay down a hand of cards nobody else in the room had known you were holding. The trust instrument, the certified 1961 deed, Silas's letter, 3 years of receipts, fanned out like a paper trail, because that is exactly what they were. Then I reached under my collar and pulled the cord over my head and held the key up where the string lights over the garden caught it and said the only thing in that entire folder that wasn't made of paper. This still opens the front door. It always has. My mother's hand found the back of the nearest chair and stayed there. My sister's face did something I had genuinely never once seen it do in 29 years of watching it. This is insane, Kendra said, too loudly, the phone finally coming down from wherever she'd been holding it all evening. You signed the release, Nora. You signed it. I did, I said. I read it twice before I signed it, actually, once at the table and once in the car. It releases my membership interest in the LLC. It says so 3 times. It doesn't mention the land once, because the land wasn't the LLC's to put in a release. I checked. My mother found her voice next, quieter than Kendra's, closer to the version of her I'd sat with on the dock in my mind, before I'd even walked to the podium. Your grandmother would never have done this to us on purpose, she said, and I answered her as gently as I could manage in front of 500 people, because some sentences, you can say gently, and still mean completely. She didn't do it to you, I said. She did it for whoever kept the key. That was always going to be somebody. It happened to be me. My father, to his credit, said nothing at all in that garden. He would say the rest of what he had to say 2 weeks later, over a half-hung door, in private, which is where I think he'd wanted to say most things his whole life, and rarely found the nerve. Todd's father was already talking, quietly and very quickly, to one of the men in the good suits, and by the time the Gazette photographer had finished the second roll of film, she started shooting the moment I picked up the microphone. 2 of the investors were already walking, unhurried but unmistakable, toward the parking lot. It was not a shout that ended it. It was a folder and a key and a garden full of people who had come to celebrate 61 years finding out, all together, in the space of about 4 minutes, exactly whose 61 years they had actually been standing in. The sale collapsed within the week. Winslow Shoreline Group quietly withdrew from the deal, and, I heard secondhand from that same old family friend, lost its bid for a separate waterfront permit 2 towns over, not long after the Gazette ran its story, complete with a photograph of the key. Todd's engagement to Kendra didn't survive the fallout either. It came out, in the weeks after, that he stood to collect a personal finder's fee from his father's company on top of the purchase price, a detail Kendra says she genuinely never knew about, and I believe her, mostly because nobody schemes for months just to be humiliated in front of 500 people on purpose. My father spent the following weeks doing something I hadn't seen him do in years, which was show up. He drove out to the carriage house on a Tuesday, our day now, it turns out, without either of us ever agreeing to that out loud, and helped me hang the last door, and told me, without quite managing to look at me while he said it, that it had always been easier to go along with my mother than to ask out loud what any of it was actually costing me. My mother and I sat on the dock the week after the party, and she finally told me the rest of what that gas station sentence had started. 34 years of running events at a place with someone else's name on the sign, someone else's mother-in-law's photograph over the mantel in the front hall, and never once, not on a single document in 3.5 decades, her own name anywhere. She told me about the year she'd suggested, gently, over dinner, that the inn's sign might read Ashford Family Inn instead of just Ashford Inn, something that would have cost nothing and meant, to her, an acknowledgement that she'd married into this and stayed for it and built 34 Augusts out of it. Ruth had said she'd think about it and never brought it up again, and Marlene had never asked twice, because asking twice for the same small thing felt worse than never asking at all. I loved her, my mother said, of Ruth, looking out at the water instead of at me. I want you to know that first, before anything else I say tonight. I loved her, and I was also so tired, for so many years, of being the person who kept this place running without ever once being written into it anywhere that mattered. When Todd started talking about the sale, some part of me thought, finally, something with my name on the check, even if it wasn't my name on the deed. I didn't say anything for a while. The lake was doing the thing it does at dusk, going flat and silver, and Biscuit was asleep between us with his head on my mother's foot, which I noticed she didn't move even once. I told her I understood wanting your name on something after 34 years of holding it up from underneath. I told her I understood it so well it frightened me a little, because I'd spent most of my own life doing a smaller version of the exact same thing. What I didn't tell her that night, because I didn't yet know how to say it kindly, was that I'd spent 3 years quietly earning my own name onto something too, the honest way, one receipt at a time, and that the difference between us, in the end, wasn't how much either of us had wanted to belong to that place. It was what we'd each been willing to let happen to somebody else in order to finally get it. I understood her a great deal better that night than I had in my entire life up to that point. I want to be honest with you about something, though, because I think it matters more than the reveal itself. Understanding where a person's cruelty came from is not the same thing as handing them back the key. Love that keeps a ledger was never love. It was only ever an invoice, waiting patiently for the right occasion to be sent. I told my parents I'd lease the operating business back to them at fair market rent, month to month, so the inn could keep running under the name it's always had, for the guests who'd been coming every August since before any of us were born. I told them the family seat at that table is still open, exactly the way it's always technically been. But I wasn't interested in being folded back into a company that only remembered I was family once the paperwork ran out on their first plan, and I said so, calmly, once, and then I let it stand as a complete sentence, the way Ruth taught me to let the important ones stand. Kendra and I don't talk much these days. That's all right. I've stopped believing that every ending in a family is required to be warm in order to count as an ending worth having. The town, for what it's worth, was kinder to me than I expected. A few of the longtime guests wrote to me directly in the weeks after, people whose kids I used to watch swim off that dock. And one of them, a retired schoolteacher named Colette, who has booked room 4 every August for 11 years running, sent a card that just said, "Ruth would be proud of your paperwork," which made me laugh out loud alone in my kitchen in a way I hadn't in months. The Gazette ran a second, smaller story a few weeks after the first, a follow-up about the inn's 60-second season opening on schedule, under its original name, and I keep the clipping in the same drawer where I keep Silas's letter and the certified deed, because I've started to understand that the ordinary, unremarkable proof of a thing continuing is its own kind of document worth filing. I still keep the guest book at the front desk, the same one Ruth started in 1961, its early pages gone soft and brown at the corners. I added an entry of my own on the night of the Founders' Weekend, after almost everyone had gone home and the string lights were still on over an empty garden. I didn't write anything dramatic. I just wrote the date and left the rest of the line blank, the way the book still had room for 61 more years of other people's handwriting underneath mine. The carriage house is finished now. I live in the 2 rooms upstairs, and I rent the parlor out for small weddings on the weekends, the kind Ruth always used to say she wished the inn itself still had room for. Biscuit, the inn's ancient golden retriever, who nobody thought to mention in any version of the sale because nobody had thought to mention him in anything for years, sleeps on my porch most nights now and makes the slow walk down to the dock with me most mornings. I make cinnamon rolls on Sundays, from the card in that recipe box, in handwriting I'd know anywhere on earth, and I leave a plate at the front desk the way Ruth always did, for whoever's checked in that week. My grandmother didn't leave me a building. She left me a promise nobody else in that family remembered how to keep, sealed in paper, 3 years before she ever needed it kept, and a key that still turns the exact same lock it turned in 1961. That's my story. 1 folder, 1 key, and a Tuesday in June that took 3 years to finish making sense. If you've ever been the quiet one, the responsible one, the one who only gets called family when somebody needs a signature, take this as your sign that a house built on your labor doesn't stop being partly yours just because nobody ever put your name on the sign out front. Share this with the person in your life who reads the fine print for everyone else and has never once been thanked for it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.